Welcome to The Vault. I'm Trisha Taurinskas. Today, we're kicking it over to Tracy Briggs. She's a reporter, a columnist, and host of the Back Then podcast. She'll be telling you a story about a former newspaper editor who was targeted by the mob. What ultimately happened to that editor? Well, Tracy will fill you in.
What led up to an alleged mob hit on a former Fargo newspaper editor in 1935? Walter Liggett was beaten up, framed on rape charges, and eventually murdered. What exactly was he writing about? In part one of a special two-part report, what led up to the slaying of Walter Liggett? Hi, this is Tracy Briggs for The Vault. Walter and Edith Liggett of Minneapolis probably figured that Monday night would be perfect for a little errand running. It was unseasonably warm for Minnesota just 2 weeks before Christmas. With a temperature nearing 40 degrees, they'd hardly need to button their coats as they walked out the door of the newspaper office they shared. After getting into the car, they drove to their print shop, picked up their daughter from the library, dropped off a friend at the bus station, and stopped for a few groceries at Swenson's on Lyndale and Lake before heading to their home not far away in South Minneapolis. Walter parked the car in an alley outside their apartment building. It was about 5:45. Just as he was getting out of the car, grocery bag in hand, he was struck in the chest, right by the heart, by 5 bullets fired from the window of a car that sped past him. He died instantly. He lay dead, spilled groceries beside him. His wife and daughter watched it all in horror from the back seat of the car. 88 years later, the murder of Walter Liggett remains one of Minnesota's most intriguing yet unsolved crimes. In part one of the slaying of Walter Liggett, what led up to the tragic night of December 9th, 1935? Walter William Liggett was born on Valentine's Day, 1886, in Benson, Minnesota, to Matilda Root Brown and William Liggett, a one-time dean of the Agricultural College of the University of Minnesota. Walter enrolled at the university in 1904. He was slender and tall, 6'4". So he boxed and he played on the football team. But he didn't stay long. Walter's daughter, Marta Liggett Woodbury, later wrote in her 1998 book, Stop the Presses, that her father left the school after his freshman year. She said, he had a scholarly side and maintained a lifelong interest in agriculture, but he was too restless and perhaps too competitive to stay in college. Woodbury said Walter was excited by the idea of the fearless journalism he was seeing in the growing muckraking movement. Muckrakers were reform-minded journalists from around 1890 to the 1920s who claimed to expose corruption and wrongdoing in established institutions. The 19-year-old Liggett found newspaper work close to home as a general reporter for the St. Paul Pioneer Press, the Minneapolis Journal, and the Minneapolis Daily News. Later, he worked at the Duluth News-Tribune and the Fargo Forum. In fact, he was just 22 years old when he left Fargo in 1908 to work at papers in Alaska and eventually Washington State. But it wouldn't be long before he'd find his way back to North Dakota and a movement that would forever change his fate. In 1915, a former organizer for the Socialist Party of America, Arthur C. Townley, founded the Nonpartisan League, or NPL. It was a political party that advocated state control of mills, grain elevators, banks, and other farm-related industries in order to reduce the power of big-time corporate interests. The League grew in power in the early 20th century after striking a nerve with small farmers in North Dakota who felt exploited by out-of-state companies. Meantime, in 1917, Liggett was back in Minnesota. He was working now at the St. Paul Dispatch, where he'd started to cover some of these NPL candidates. He became so taken by their message that he quit straight journalism to work as head of publicity for the NPL. Townley moved Liggett to North Dakota, where Liggett helped start NPL newspapers in 50 of North Dakota's 53 counties, including Bismarck's Capital Daily Press, where he was the editor, and the Fargo Courier-News, where he was the managing editor. Their job was to spread the progressive message of the NPL across the Dakotas and beyond. By 1918, Liggett had turned his attention back to his home state of Minnesota, where together with Townley, they helped found the Farmer Labor Party, which was basically an offspring of the NPL and the Union Labor Party of Duluth. It's interesting to note that the other co-founder of the Farmer Labor Party was Charles Lindbergh Sr., the famous aviator's father. Eventually, Liggett's work took him away from the Midwest to both Washington, D.C. and New York City, where he continued to champion progressive causes. In 1929, he vaulted to national prominence with a series of stories he wrote for Plain Talk magazine, which examined how prohibition brought about corruption in cities from Boston to Minneapolis. He became such an expert on prohibition that he was the first witness called to testify before Congress as it considered a repeal of the 18th Amendment. While he was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize for these articles and garnered acclaim for other books and articles he wrote at this time, he was starting to make enemies among the gangsters who got rich during Prohibition and the government officials who helped them. By the early 1930s, Liggett and his wife Edith were living comfortably in New York City with their two children, Wallace and Marta. He spent his days writing books, one of them a scathing negative biography of Herbert Hoover. But by 1933, the Liggetts were looking to move back to Minnesota. In her book, Marta explained, "I don't know exactly why my father suddenly decided to return to Minnesota to run a country newspaper, the Northland Times in Bemidji. But I'm sure he, as a longtime believer in a third party, was in part drawn back to Minnesota by the seeming resurgence of the Farmer Labor Party under Governor Floyd Olson." Many of Liggett's friends from the old days of the NPL and the Farmer Labor Party were excited that a farmer labor candidate had taken the state's top office for the first time. And in fact, Olson greeted Liggett warmly when he arrived in Minnesota. But all of that was about to change in a very big way. Liggett and Edith, who was also a journalist, started a new newspaper called the Midwest American. As the Liggetts tackled political news of the day, they came to the conclusion that the Farmer Labor Party Walter had left 12 years ago to move to the East Coast had changed. They were concerned about corruption under the political machine of Governor Olson. Liggett believed Olson to be a traitor to the farmer labor cause because of the compromises he had to make to get reelected. While Olson remained fairly popular with the public, the Liggetts would have nothing of it. They continued to claim that not only was Olson in bed with big business, but he was also colluding with organized crime. So, Liggett did what he always did. He wrote about it. A lot. In a series of articles for the paper, Liggett demanded Olson be impeached and prosecuted, in part because of his ties to gangster Isidore Kid Can Blumenfeld, who Liggett said got immensely wealthy as Minnesota politicians like Olson looked the other way during Prohibition. In fact, Liggett pointed out that Olson and Blumenfeld grew up in the same neighborhood in North Minneapolis, and he alleged that Olson was continuing to do favors for his childhood pal. But as Liggett wore out the printing presses with story after story about Twin Cities corruption, he soon faced something completely unexpected. Just a year after his return to Minnesota and the dozens of scathing articles about Blumenfeld and Olson, Liggett was arrested on statutory rape charges. The claim was that Liggett and a union official had lured two teenage girls to a hotel in Minneapolis where they spent the night, quote, drinking and spooning with them, end quote. Liggett categorically denied the allegations. The case went to trial when things were about to get even worse for Liggett. Stories of exactly what happened the night of October 24th, 1935 differ. But in her book, Marta Woodbury, Liggett's daughter, said her parents' story was that Walter had been invited to the Radisson Hotel by a woman named Antoinette Fawcett, In some newspaper reports, she is called Annette Fawcett, but I will call her Antoinette. She had once run a casino of sorts at Breezy Point Resort on Pelican Lake with her husband, Captain Billy Fawcett. He was a colorful character and the editor and publisher of a bawdy men's humor magazine called Captain Billy's Whiz Bang. The Fawcetts hobnobbed with celebrities and high-level officials, including Governor Olson. It was also rumored that Antoinette had an affair with Governor Olson, leading to her eventual divorce from Captain Billy. Antoinette was now in the Twin Cities. So that night, she reportedly called the offices of the Midwest American to tell Walter Liggett that she had vital information about his trial on the statutory rape charges. She invited him to come to her hotel suite. According to Woodbury's book, after Liggett arrived at Fawcett's suite, he heard the phone ring. Fawcett picked it up. Isidore Kid Can Blumenfeld, Minnesota's #1 gangster, was on the other end of the line. Woodbury wrote, Walter heard her say into the phone, "The gentleman is here now." Woodbury said Blumenfeld arrived a short time later and offered her father a bribe, which he refused, as he said he'd be worse than the racketeers if he took it. However, in some newspaper reports, Blumenfeld later claimed it was Liggett who tried to shake him down for money. Again, accounts differ slightly as to what happened next, whether Blumenfeld took a swing at Liggett, or the two men fought, or whether Liggett was jumped by Blumenfeld's thugs. But according to his daughter, he arrived home at 2 a.m., severely beaten and nearly unconscious. Liggett's trial on the rape charges was scheduled just days later, and the judge declined a motion to delay it, even though Liggett had been beaten severely. So, as the trial began, Liggett's face was still swollen and bruised. He sported a black eye and bruised ribs that wouldn't let him sit up completely straight. Fortunately for Liggett, the teenage girls at the center of the morals charges proved to be unreliable witnesses who had been coached in their testimony by a pair of officials who had ties to the Farmer Labor Party. Woodbury actually interviewed one of the girls years later. She spoke with Jenny over the phone for about 5 minutes. Jenny was now in her 70s and a mother and grandmother. She didn't want to get into any details with the daughter of the man she had accused 60 years earlier, but she expressed regret and said, "Nothing happened. It was all political. I was just a kid at the time, and I didn't know what I was getting into. But I can truthfully say nothing really happened." A jury found Liggett not guilty of the charges on November 9th, 1935. Editor and Publisher magazine called the trial a brazen use of political power to silence a free editor, and the charge itself a palpable frame-up from its start. But Liggett's troubles were far from over. Exactly 1 month to the day later, he would be dead. Next time, in part 2 of the slaying of Walter Liggett, details of the Tommy gun drive-by shooting and the controversial trial of the high-profile suspect.